In international relations over the last couple decades, the democratic peace theory seems to be a foundation of how democratic states view other states and the global order. Just to sum it up, the theory of democratic peace stems from Emmanuel Kant's To Perpetual Peace. And in this, basically, he writes that a republican constitution is the most desirable circumstance for peace. And he says the absence of war is dependent on mutual respect between states based on regime. In quotes, he says, if consent of the citizens is required to decide whether or not war is to be declared, it is very natural that they will have great hesitation in embarking on such a dangerous enterprise. So, in a nutshell, democratic peace says that democracies will not typically go to war against other democracies. So, the general idea is that if every democracy in the world were to have some sort of large conflict, they would choose something else over war. So we're going to cover that today on the Tonic Accord and talk about that theory. Is it correct? Is it outdated? Is it wrong? We shall see. How's it going, Drew? How's the week treating you?
Good, man. Still staying inside, still working from home. It's kind of the same every week here in 2020. But I think that I'm excited for this week because we're talking about, one, a big international relations theory, which is always fun. I think you and I both enjoy that. And then the other topic is kind of international relations related as well, more based on a headline. But it's like the first time in a while that you and I haven't focused on U.S. elections. So I'm pretty happy. I'm glad to put the U.S. elections aside in a way because they're done. And get on to something else. So, yeah, democratic peace theory. I mean, it's pretty obvious to me that it exists, right? I think we statistically see the idea that democratic states go to war less with other democratic states than other types of regimes. But I think the main question is why. Emmanuel Kant believed and led the belief that it's because of the regime selection that is why it happens. But it seems that more over time, there's been an increase in criticism that it's not based on the regime of democracy itself, but other factors of just like geopolitical factors and cultural factors and a host of other things that we'll dive into. So I think one of the main questions is it's not necessarily is democratic peace theory, does it exist, but it's why does it exist?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And, that's like my first takeaway is that I don't know if we have a big enough of sample size to actually say if this is a valid, theory or not. Because to me, Kant talked about this, and I think the late 1800s or something like that. And pretty much since then, there actually really weren't that many democracies in the world until kind of after the Cold War. Like, if you really think about it, democracy is somewhat of a new construct in terms of global acceptance of it, right? Like, the United States is almost like a predecessor for democracy, but a lot of the world was behind that. And so I kind of wonder about the theory because to me it seemed to kind of get back into the mainstream following the Cold War, but it used a very small sample size, because during the time of the Cold War, I was reading an article called "How Convincing is the Democratic Peace Thesis?" And they talk about about the time of the Cold War, there was only like 10 to 15 actual democracies in the world, and they didn't fight each other. But my thesis and my kind of theory on this is that it was capitalism and globalization that actually were the root of unifying these countries more than just the democratic institutions. And we can obviously get into that in much more detail later, but I just think that it's a very simple thing to just say that democracies won't fight each other because of their institutions of democracy. Because, I'm not going to get too far into it now, but, countries act differently domestically than they do internationally. And a democracy sometimes doesn't act like a democracy on the world stage. So to me, there's something else. There's a missing link than just if you're a democracy, you're not going to go to war with another democracy.
Right. Well, let's dive into it. So you think it's capitalism?
Yeah.
I mean, do you think it's like the countries that have it's a dedication to the idea of capitalism, or do you think it's more of the result of capitalism as far as like economic entanglement, whether they like it or not? Because, I guess maybe I'm more cynical, right? I don't necessarily see a block of the world that is like, writing pro-capitalist articles as far as international relations go. I think it's more like, because I think I agree with what you're saying, but in this sort of like economic entanglement. I think if you look
Huh.
at the Cold War, I think a lot of people, and I think again, I think economic entanglement goes to realism. I think a lot of people in the Cold War was, my choices are either I go with the USSR or I go with the United States, and it's economically and politically and militaristically more beneficial for me if I'm a Western European nation to just ally with the U.S. And so I see it in more of like a realistic, like, you know, like. Like had the USSR been so much more dominant of a force and had a better economy, we might be having the conversation of communist peace theory, right? I think it was more that the United States became such a hegemony that people followed suit because it was out of their personal interest to go along with the coattails.
That's a really good point. And you know, I agree with you to a certain extent here, especially in the fact that I think you're right. It's more the entanglement that globalization's created. And so I'm actually not really talking about, say, earlier capitalism, like, you know, the mercantile capitalism,
Sure.
say, of what, like the 1800s. I'm kind of thinking about, I guess we could say probably New World, like kind of the U.S. setup order following the Cold War, kind of, you know, I mean, almost going back to our rural urban divide episode a couple weeks ago, kind of that post-Soviet Cold War era where the world was, you know, China got accepted to the WTO in I think 2000 or 2001, stuff like that, right? Where the world was kind of slowly being forced to entangle and work together. And that's where I kind of feel that the outcome is because I always use the example of China right off the bat. China is an authoritarian dictatorship that flourishes with capitalism. And capitalism is their driving factor. Like, China has shown us that you don't need democratic institutions to have free markets.
100%.
And obviously, you know, and obviously we could debate the efficacy of these free markets, because obviously they're state run and it's not particularly a free market in terms of like the Adam Smith Western kind of view of it. But they are trading on an open market with a lot of the world, and a lot of the West relies on China. And it's funny because in a lot of ways, the West should be fighting with China. And I know there's skirmishes, especially since Trump's been in office, about that. But I think there's a reason since 2000 that the United States has kind of turned a blind eye to China, even though they're a bad actor. And I think it's because of the capitalist global order that we're currently living in. And because China violates human rights, they're locking up Muslims, they don't believe in free speech, democratic values. Those are all things that you would think, especially in the Cold War scope of things, we would have gone to war with them. We would have called them an enemy and had these proxy wars. But how come we never worried about China? It's because we always saw their capital growth, I think. And we always saw their capital potential. And I think it's almost like actually these global markets that have us so intertwined with one another are more of the reason why we're afraid to really do much with China than actual, oh, they're a democracy. And I agree with you that I think realism was a driving factor of a lot of this as well. Like, I've always been kind of in between a constructivist and a realist when it comes to kind of my worldview. For people who don't know, you know, like constructivism is the idea that kind of culture and historically produced ideas are what kind of lead a country's dynamics in terms of geopolitics. Realism is kind of basically a, you know, chicken game. What's it called? A game of chicken. I feel like realism is kind of a game of chicken. Like, who are these actors? What's in our best interest? And I've always kind of fallen in between. And I think democratic peace theory is almost too idealistic. But I just do say that. I always use the example of China because I think China almost is the exception to democratic peace theory, because it's not a democracy and we are technically at peace with them.
Yeah, and you know, perhaps you know, the theory, like perhaps what held together these peaceful nations before is changing. Perhaps it used to be more constructivist, right? Because I do think part of it's there. I think there's a culture of democracy that, and they mentioned it, and you know, you and I both read that Oxford Research Encyclopedia piece on "Is Democracy a Cause of Peace?" Right, trying to find the causation in this theory, and you know, and they talked about how, you know, cultural respect of institutions is a part of it, right? I think democratic nations, just by being democratic, have more of a respect for like public opinion and the people's voice, right? Because that's the institutionally how it's, you know, how it's determined. Like, democracy is a majority public opinion kind of thing. And so I get that constructed idea that democracies do value peace and public opinion more, and multilateral institutions and cooperation, because that's kind of the nature of democracy. However, we've also seen that democracies don't always value peace and don't always value international law. I mean, the United States pretty blatantly goes against international law and just says screw off, or has in the past.
Right.
And that we're a functioning democracy till today. So it's a part of it. I do think that it's a part of it, right? Especially earlier on in the 20th century, I think that perhaps nations, because it was still like this, it did really feel like a battle for the soul of the world. Was, are we going to go become democracy, or are we going to go the way of fascism or communism? I think there was a lot more banding together when there was this giant monster of another regime. Now that it's like what you said, we're more globally entangled with non-democracies like China and Russia. You know, the waters are more muddied, and I don't think that there's these strong bonds culturally with democracies. I think now that the bonds that are there between democracies are less based on cultural constructivism and are now more based on, like we talked about, economic entanglements and hard realistic anarchic realism of the international relations. So, and so I think perhaps, like you said, it is a little bit in the middle, but it's changing, I think, more towards the realistic side as more people get in bed with China. Alliances aren't based off of regimes anymore.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And no, I mean, I think you're correct. And, I mean, I think it's a really good point to make, and you did it well, is that, democracies aren't always peaceful. And 9/11 always screams that to me personally, because there's a great article that I actually just read the abstract because it was really long, but it had a good point in it, and it was called "The Flawed Logic of Democratic Peace Theory," and it's from the American Political Science Review, and it's by Sebastian Rosado. I do recommend people, if you have a lot of time, sit down and read it. But he says that, in quotes here, democracies do not reliably externalize their domestic norms of conflict resolution, and they do not trust or respect one another when their interests clash. And I think that is an interesting thing to think about, like that just because you're a democracy internally doesn't mean that the way you treat the rest of the world order is potentially in that same scope of things. And I would just go even like a little bit further and say that, like Emmanuel Kant, when he says, in quotes, if consent of the citizens is required to decide whether or not war is to be declared, it is very natural that they will have great hesitation in embarking on such a dangerous enterprise if the people don't back it. So like his idea is that, because the people are like have a say in how the country runs, the people are going to go against war. But my question, it's kind of just rhetorical to everyone, is what happens when the people want war and the government doesn't think it's a good idea? And I think we have seen that in democracies. Not that the government doesn't see it's a good idea, but I always think about 9/11 and a mix of misrepresented data, mob mentality, groupthink, and the United States was very war ready. And I think we've seen this happen a lot of times over the last couple decades. Now, obviously, terrorism is not a democracy, so it's not like we're going to war with another democracy. But I almost think that it doesn't really matter if it's war against another democracy or war against another country. It's still war. And so if there's still instability in the world, I don't really think it matters if the U.S. goes to war against Germany or something, because in the end of the day, Germany and the U.S., I think that goes back to the constructivist kind of view, is that Germany and the United States, for example, this is just an example, is Germany and the U.S. have a shared kind of, like especially since World War II and kind of especially after the end of the Cold War, there's kind of a shared cultural idea and a historical memory of what's happened. And I think that's sometimes more important than actually being a democracy. And like, just last thing I'll say here is that the example I always like to use of the constructivist one is India and the United States. Because from 1949 to 1969, India was actually a Soviet partner, though they were technically a democracy. And so India was an ally of the Soviet Union and all their satellites, while also being a democracy. And so finally Nixon and Kissinger by the 70s had pressured India into relooking at like that whole stance. And they turned away and had a ceasefire with the United States and our other allies. And Nixon and Kissinger were quoted basically saying that this is because it's a democracy and they realized democracies can't go to war. But in reality, it's because India had a faith that it was a dumb idea. They had a calculation that it's a dumb idea to go to war with the U.S., but it wasn't because of their democratic norms. It was because of the situation they were in at the time. And it's more the institutions were not important, but the actual trajectory of where the country was going was more important. And I don't think I explained that too well, but it's I don't know, it's weird.
No, I mean it makes sense, and I'm gonna like the idea that a functioning democracy then leads to more peaceful action. I think is disproven, right? Because again, like like you've said, you can have a functioning democracy and the people could want war, right? Like after 9/11 in the United States. Or you could have a functioning democracy and the people don't want war and the country still goes to war, which is also
Right.
currently happening in the United States and has been since like 2004, 2005. Eventually, the Iraq and Afghanistan wars became unpopular, and yet here we are. So, I mean, right? So you can even have public opinion be against the action, and the actions are still carried out, and it's a functioning democracy. So this idea that a democracy would not carry out, a violent action against another because public opinion would sway it away. I mean, I don't see the evidence for that. I do buy that democracies don't go to war with other democracies as much. And I do think it's mostly because of the realism, like you talked about. Pakistan and Iran are another example of both democracies that hate each other. They have nukes looking at each other, and and I don't think either a Pakistani or an Indian military general would say, well, we have nukes pointing at each other, but we're not sending them because they're a democracy. They're saying we have nukes pointing at each other, but we're not sending them because I don't want to die today. Right? I don't want them to blow up a country. I think it's more of that realism and I'm gonna get a little goofy here because like why not? I like during this quarantine I've been watching a lot of Survivor, the show Survivor. Where people are on. Have you watched it? Do you like it or?
Oh yeah. I haven't watched a shit ton or a bunch of it, excuse me, but it's a good show. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they have a bunch of seasons on Netflix now. But that whole thing is about like who's making alliances with who and who's backstabbing who and whatever. And a lot of people assume that you have like, oh, all the girls are forming a girl alliance, right? When in reality, they're not, right? So I think the same thing with democracy is I think we assume alliances based off of a preconceived notion that maybe had more truth in the 20th century, but I think it's breaking down quickly in the 21st century. One of the comments, even in our chat, talked about and I'm Dark Sage, and we do see your comment. We're just kind of on a topic right now, so I can't go too far in it. But it has a little bit to do. He's talking about, what do we feel about a far-right Germany inspiring European nations, right?
Get up there. Oh.
Oop.
Oh.
I had a little pop up there. Sorry.
Hey, that happens. The internet. You have the United States itself questioning whether we even have a functioning democracy. I still believe we do, but some people don't. Right, so I don't see democracy as some golden standard, and I don't think it's something that we can just assume will always be around and provide this umbrella of peace like we're used to. I think that the peace and democracy have come about side by happenstance, more based on the hegemonic power of the United States and their military might and the alliances they've made in the global stage of the 20th century. That's why. I don't think it has to do with the regime so much.
Yeah, and no, I mean I totally agree with you. And what I would say, hopefully trying to answer this question on Twitch and kind of go to your realist thing, is that kind of the realist counter argument I feel like to democratic peace theory would be that I think people who support democratic peace theory are too focused on the emphasis on the system of democracy as being the driver for peace, but they're not looking at the individual actors inside of a country or a system.
Right.
And I think that's kind of what you were saying. And also that would go to what happens if Nazi Germany or an extreme Germany was a forefront. It would be the individuals inside of the system. Like democracy is only as strong as the people running it. And I mean, Bush called the war on terror a crusade, and that was a really kind of a rallying call. And that's the role of individuals. That's the role of individuals who are trying to articulate a point, either if it's good or not. And so I totally agree with you, and I think that we just kind of overemphasize democracy.
Yes.
And,
yeah,
sorry.
No, I was going to say, how do we even define it? Because it's like Turkey's a democracy. But is Turkey really on, like, would you consider Turkey to be in the same allyship of the Western democracies? I don't know, not really on paper, but we talked about how Greece and Turkey, have jets aiming at each other constantly.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's really true, and that kind of reminds me of like your great example of India and Pakistan. I mean, these are countries that have a lot of cultural shared history. These are countries that are both on paper democracies, and they clearly would blow each other up because of individual actors and also constructivism in the history of where these countries are at. And that's why I still like to. I really want to just put down my point that it's money, it's capital, it's
Mm.
that's what does it. And the Cato Institute, and obviously the Cato Institute is quite conservative, quite pro-capitalist, and pretty libertarian. But I do think they have a really good point, is that it's kind of almost the chicken or the egg argument. Is it that democracy caused these countries to be more stable and more peaceful? Or is it that the stability from open markets actually allowed them to create better institutions that inevitably led to better systems? And there's a guy, Eric Gartsky, who's Columbia University professor, and he says the democratic peace is just a mirage. And it's created by the overlap between economics and political freedom that's created by just larger markets.
Mm.
And so I think that's why the West is never at war. And, just challenge yourself to think, like, is it actually democracy? Because there's so many different democratic systems in the West. Or is it the fact that these are wealthy countries that are trading amongst each other? And because people, I mean, obviously, with people have more money, they have more access to institutions, education, mobility and markets. Like, I think it's almost like the two are intertwined, but you can't really put one in front of the other, and it gets complicated there. But that, like, the point is that democracy is not valueless. Like, I think democracy is obviously crucial,
Oh my gosh, yeah.
but free political systems neutrally, entail free elections and blah blah blah. But I think it's actually having money and a shared trade network and cooperation with other countries that might go ahead of actually democratic
Yeah,
institutions.
I think that's right. I think that's right. I think it's personal interest, economic entanglements, political realities that
Mm-hmm.
are more persuasive than the idea that take those things. Imagine if all those things were bad, right? Imagine if being an ally with someone was financially irresponsible, politically damaging, and you know what I mean, militarily risky. You wouldn't do it because, well, all those things are really bad, but I'm so loyal to the concept of a democratic regime. I don't see that happening. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Right.
I don't see nations acting that way. I don't see the United States sticking its neck out. Like, the United States didn't like stick its neck out for South Korea out of the good of its heart. We defended South Korea because we wanted to block communism and Russian influence in that area. Same thing with Vietnam. It just didn't go as well. Like, this idea of like saving democracies for the sake of democracy is just, I think it's a little overblown, a little overhyped, and a little too blinded in patriotism and propaganda. I think the reality is what you said, is economic entanglements. And I think to go even farther is that's why it's scary. That's why it's important that we actually have to consistently remind people and educate people how important democracy is. Because democracy is not inherently tied to peace and the maintenance of that peace. We have to consistently harvest the benefits of democracy and educate people on it, because as we can see, as our person in the chat pointed out, in places that you would consider to be a part of this democratic bloc, there are far right radical groups that want autocracy. There is the movement in the United States to completely negate the election results. There's significant movements that are gaining popularity in democratic nations that are, in my view, anti-democratic. So, this idea of like, oh, well, we're in the democracy phase now, and it's brought all this peace. We're good. Like, no, I think it's crumbling. One is, we've talked about, I don't think democratic peace theory is as strong as it used to be, and two is, because all of this alliances and peace is not inherently tied to the democratic regime, then people will be willing to abandon democracy if it means maintaining their power. And we're seeing that happen in Turkey. We're seeing that happen in Russia. We're seeing that happen, or tried to happen, in the United States.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct. And also, I mean, it's even closer. I mean, the EU, Hungary, and I think it was Hungary and Poland a couple of days ago are helping block the EU stimulus right now because they've kind of been cast out by the EU because technically they're EU members, but they violated like every rule known to man in the EU. And you and I have talked about Viktor Orban before. He's an autocrat. He does not value democracy. But because Hungary on Wikipedia, if you typed in Hungary, they would have some form of a representative democracy. Actually, yeah, for fun here, I'm going to type in Hungary. Let's see what Hungary says on Wikipedia in terms of what their democratic or what their government says. So keep with me here. Government, it's a unitary dominant party parliamentary constitutional republic. So at least they do have unitary in there because that's where they're going. But yeah, it's a parliamentary constitutional republic. That's not the case. They've stymied almost every aspect of the Constitution of the free press, and I think that's the issue is that, man, bad actors are finding that you can be safe from aggression, especially from the UN and stuff, if you have a seat at the table because of wealth and your voice. And democracy is receding around the world. So my question to you is, like, what do we do with like a country like China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, countries that are technically allies, technically on paper, like they give us things we need, so we kind of feel like we can't do anything about the things they're violating. You know what I mean? It's like this dangerous circle.
Well, I mean, again, that's why. I mean, I think one is I don't think we're allies with China. We're like we have a trade partnership, right?
Fair.
And I think,
but we haven't attacked China on Chinese soil. So,
no, of course, and I don't think we should. I'm not arguing. I don't think we should at all. But I think something like that is like, I think you do need someone to kind of foster again that constructivist idea. Right, I think everyone is getting it. I mean, especially during the Trump era, you heard it again. You heard it from Merkel out of her mouth. We can't rely on the United States as much anymore. And Germany's on her own, right? I think that all that stuff is people are getting more into the realistic weeds, which is how. Okay, look, I don't know what's going on with the world stage. I don't know. The hegemonic power is changing. I need to just do what's best for me. I think you need a leader in the United States to kind of shepherd the sheep back. Like, hold on. Let's go back to our constructivist idea. Let's get back this Western democratic bloc. Let's call out the people that are against our values instead of, but it takes a leader and it takes cooperation with our allies to do that. And unfortunately, we haven't done that enough recently. And perhaps we didn't even do it strong enough, in the Obama era. But I really think getting back our allies in Europe and maintaining good allies in Asia, like India, is the key to counterbalancing the hegemonic power of China. Now, it might not necessarily be all based on democracy, right? Like we're saying, it might just have to be that reality is, look, we all got to band together or China's going to become the octopus that dominates the world. That might have to be the sell, right? Maybe it's not this whole, let's bring back the golden era of democracy. It might just be fight for our freaking lives. But someone has to do that. Someone has to get people together because you're right. If the United States just stops playing ball in the international game, China will become the octopus that has its hand in everything in the globe, if not it already.
Yeah, and it's because I think you've talked a lot about realism, and I think China's almost like the perfect global actor that's realist. They don't really particularly worry about democratic values or human rights or whatever
or even ideology at all. I mean, the old Maoist China is gone. Xi Jinping doesn't care about what Mao would think. Who cares about what true communism means if you're just gaining power?
Totally. And so I think that almost it's kind of made the world transactional. And so I feel like going forward, we should forget about democratic enforcement, democratic peace, and we should think about how can we find a way to have conscious capitalism or like conscious transactions that can still reflect human values, but also we're going to have to deal with actors who maybe don't value the individual like we do. And that's, I think, one of the tough parts that democratic peace theory, for example, can't answer, and the last thing I said, and I wish I mentioned it earlier, is that, Samuel Huntington, who's kind of over the time become quite a controversial figure. He's been called everything from racist to xenophobic. I think it's more complicated than that. For people who don't know, he was a political scientist. I think he died in early 2000s, late 90s. I don't particularly know specifics, but he always talked about kind of a clash of civilizations. He was kind of known as a realist mixed with constructivist. And he thought the next coming problem was not going to be nation states, but culture. And I think a lot of people took that as kind of xenophobic and anti-immigrant. But I always took it as that when you get over nation states, there is a schism between Western values and Eastern values. And the Orient, or now I guess the Middle East, has kind of served as kind of this intermediary, kind of the landing pad between these two different worldviews. And I almost feel like that's kind of how we need to more look at the world. Is there democracy doesn't quite solve the problem. It is this constructivist history and tradition and culture that kind of all have come together into this world order. And I think that's why we're down to work with China, because we know that culturally we don't share a lot, but we also share money and we share global growth. And I don't think Samuel Huntington was totally wrong when he said the next conflict that's coming is not nations, but it's cultures.
Perhaps, maybe not in the same context as he thought of, but
Right.
But perhaps, I mean, it really does feel like, in my opinion, it really does feel like there is this battle of like, is democracy still viable and considered the best form of representation? And it feels like it's a losing battle, and most people are saying, not as much anymore. I worry.
Yeah.
Like I know. Like obviously we have to be a trade partner with China. We can't just like ignore them, right? I'm not, but I really do think that if we don't start to reconstruct what the strong bloc like there was in the 20s, in my opinion, the democratic peace theory is crumbling. We can't rely on democracy to be the sole purpose of it, but perhaps we can reconstruct some of those similar alliances with those particular nation states, so that we don't start talking about the Chinese peace theory of, every nation that does a lot of deals with China doesn't attack another nation that does deals with China. Like, I don't want to have that conversation, basically.
No, I definitely don't either. And I mean, just to be optimistic, I mean, there still is a high level. I mean, asterisk it, because with Trump, I mean, we could say that's declined a little bit, but there has been a high level of connection, peace, and cooperation between the U.S. and our Western allies. I mean, especially France. Like, I think France doesn't get enough talk. Like,
France is like one of our best allies ever. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's an interesting fact. It's one of the only countries in the world that we've never had any conflicts with ever. But that's more culture to me than just democracy alone, obviously. But there is peace out there, and I do think that if you have stable institutions that believe in free speech, equality, and justice for all, I do think that does put you at least on a foundation of believing the same thing, and that's good to have.
It is. I think the last thing I want to say is, I also think that the democratic peace theory, I mean, especially Emmanuel Kant, he could not have predicted the misinformation internet world that we have, right? Because the whole democratic peace theory is about, they won't go to war with each other with ground troops and have over 1,000 deaths. That was kind of the criteria we saw in this Oxford Encyclopedia article. Was like, the criteria for what war was like ground troops and shooting rifles and stuff. Well, how do you account for misinformation and hacking campaigns from foreign actors to subvert your democracy? What does that count as in the democratic peace theory? Because Russia is on paper a democracy and constantly engages in subverting democracies around the world. But it's not technically an act of war. So, I don't think the democratic peace theory even could account for what we even define as war now. War has changed. The world has changed. The way we interact as people, even physically, is changing. So I just think it's an outdated way of looking at the relationships we have internationally, and maybe it was more applicable in the 20th century, and I think it was. I think it was more applicable in the past. But this theory is sinking. There are holes in it, and we're seeing it more and more every day, in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. And the last thing I'll say is that I think this theory, in a very black and white sense, looks at states versus states. And I have always believed, and there's a lot of evidence, especially from the Brookings Institute and these other international think tanks, who just talk about how terrorism is almost the Achilles heel for democracy.
Right.
And so I would really believe that those attacks in Kenya and then 9/11 kind of were the last nail in the coffin for this theory, because it just muddles the waters on who is peaceful, who is not, and how do you deal with foreign enemies. And, I mean, why do you think most Americans, even though Obama had restraint, why do you think most of Americans said, let's invade Syria, after Assad's chemical warfare? Why do you think most Americans supported attacking Al-Qaeda, I mean, whatever country they were in, or we justified being in after 9/11? I mean, it's because terrorism is almost antithetical to what is to be a democracy, because the more terrorism exists, in a way, the more democratic the country is, and the more you get rid of it, the less democratic the system is. And so it gets, because terrorism is almost like an extreme expression of pain, suffering, and free will. And so how do you limit that and also keep a democracy? So I do think you're right, is that we're almost using the context of a time that no longer exists. And that makes it difficult. So maybe there's a new theory coming out. Maybe you and I will brainstorm it one day. I don't know, man, but it's complicated. It's really complicated.
Yeah, well, that's always a good way to end. It is always pretty complicated.
Yes. And with that, check us out, guys. We're out there. Let us know if you like the conversation. What can we improve on? We're on YouTube, Podbean, Apple Podcasts, iTunes, some random podcast sites that I still have never heard of, but they keep popping up. So keep listening, whatever you're doing. I appreciate it. As always, it's fun to talk, Drew, and everyone stay sane and safe and healthy.
Take care, all.